So, my girlfriend Jess and I had been planning this road trip for months. We both needed a break from work and figured a weekend getaway to the countryside would be perfect. We mapped out this whole route, but of course we are the kind of people who always look for shortcuts. Big mistake. The trip started fine. We were blasting music, laughing and enjoying the open road. About halfway through, Jess noticed a road on the GPS that cut off a good 40 minutes. It was one of those small back roads, but we figured why not. We wanted to get to the cabin sooner, maybe even catch the sunset. The detour started out fine, but after a while, the road got narrower and bumpier. The trees were so thick that sunlight barely broke through, and there wasn't a single other car in sight. And then it happened. The car started making this weird clunking sound. I pulled over and popped the hood, pretending I knew what I was doing, which I really didn't. Everything looked fine, but the car wouldn't start back up. Jess checked her phone for a signal. Nothing. We were officially in the middle of nowhere. We figured we'd just wait for someone to pass by, but after sitting there for 20 minutes, we realized no one was coming. That's when Jess pointed out a building off in the distance. It was hard to see through the trees, but it looked like a church. We should go check it out, she said. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but what choice did we have? We locked up the car and started walking. As we got closer, things started feeling off. The church looked old, like it had been there forever, but it wasn't run down. The grass around it was neatly trimmed and the paint on the walls looked fresh. It didn't make sense though. There were no streetlights, no power lines, nothing. And it was quiet. I don't mean regular countryside quiet, I mean dead quiet. No birds, no bugs, not even the wind. Just us and the crunch of gravel road under our feet. When we got to the church, I noticed there were no cars or bikes or anything outside. No signs of people. I started to get this weird feeling in my gut like we shouldn't be there. But Jess was determined. Maybe there's a caretaker or someone inside, she said. The front door was locked, so we pushed it open. The inside was strange. It looked like a regular church at first, wooden pews, an altar, stained glass windows, but then we noticed the decorations. Instead of crosses, there were these weird symbols carved into the walls and painted onto the windows. In the center of the room, there was this giant circle drawn on the floor, surrounded by candles. It looked like something out of a movie, the kind of thing you'd see in a scene that doesn't end well. We were about to leave when we heard it. A low murmur coming from somewhere deep inside. Jess grabbed my arm. Maybe it's a service, she whispered. I shook my head. There's no way. Look at this place. But before we could decide what to do, the murmuring got louder. We froze, trying to figure out where it was coming from. That's when we saw them. A group of people walked into the room from the side door. They were wearing long robes and their faces were covered with these strange masks. I can't even describe them properly, just unnatural. They didn't seem to notice us at first, which gave us a few seconds to hide behind one of the pews. From where we were crouching, we could see them gathering around the circle on the floor. One of them started speaking, but it wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language I've ever heard. Jess squeezed my arm. We need to get out of here, she whispered. I nodded, but before we could move, Jess accidentally bumped into the pew. It made this loud creak and every single person in the room turned to look at us. I'll never forget the way they moved. It was like they were all connected, like they weren't even human. One by one they pulled off their masks and I felt my stomach drop. Their faces were wrong. Not deformed or anything, just blank. No expression, no emotion. Just empty stares that seemed to pierce right through me. One of them stepped forward and said something, but I couldn't understand it. It sounded like a question, but his tone was cold, almost mocking. Jess grabbed my hand and whispered, "Run." We bolted for the door. I could hear them behind us, their footsteps echoing through the church. When we got outside, the sun was almost gone and the whole place was bathed in this eerie twilight. We sprinted back to the car and for a second, I thought they were going to catch us. But when we got to the car, they just stopped. They stood there in front of the church, watching us. Not moving, not shouting, just watching. I fumbled with the keys, praying the car would start. When the engine finally roared to life, I felt a wave of relief. But as I put the car in gear, Jess gasped. "Look," she said, pointing out the window. The group was still there, but now there were more of them. Dozens of people standing in front of the church, all staring at us. We didn't stick around to see what they were planning. I slammed on the gas and sped down the road, not stopping until we were miles away. When we finally got back to civilization, we pulled into a gas station and tried to explain what had happened. The clerk just gave us a weird look and said there wasn't any church on that road. Jess and I didn't say much on the drive home. We were too shaken up. I don't know what we walked into that day, and honestly, I don't want to know. I don't even know how to start this. I just need to get it off my chest because it's been eating at me for months now. Growing up, church was always a big part of my life. My family never missed a Sunday, and our priest, Father Thomas, was like another member of the family. He baptized me, married my parents, and even gave the eulogy at my grandma's funeral. When Father Thomas passed away last year, it was like a hole opened up in our community. He was old, so it wasn't unexpected, but still, it hit us all hard. The church felt emptier without him, even when it was full of people. About a month after he passed, the diocese sent a new priest to take over. His name was Father Andrew, and from the moment he walked into the church, people were drawn to him. He was young, probably in his late 30s, with his booming voice and a way of talking that made you want to hang on to every word. At first, I thought he was exactly what our church needed. He brought energy back to the place, cracked jokes during sermons, and even set up a bunch of community events. Everyone loved him. My parents couldn't stop talking about how blessed we were to have him. But even in those early days, something about him didn't sit right with me. It started with little things you wouldn't even notice if you weren't paying attention, like how he'd subtly criticize Father Thomas during his sermons. He never outright said anything bad, but he'd make comments like, "We can't live in the past," or "The old ways might have worked for some, but we need to be stronger now." I didn't like it, but I figured maybe he was just trying to establish himself. Then there were the changes he made to the services. He got rid of some of the prayers we'd always said and replaced them with ones he'd written himself. At first, people thought it was refreshing, but the new prayers were strange to say the least. They talked a lot about enemies, about how we needed to protect ourselves from outside influences. It was subtle though, and nobody seemed to think much of it. Nobody except me. Over time, his sermons started to shift. He still had that charisma, that way of making you feel like he was speaking directly to you, but the things he said started to bother me. He'd talk about how the world was full of sin and how it was up to us to purify it. At first, I thought he meant in a spiritual way, like helping people find God. But then he started talking about how we needed to separate ourselves from people who didn't share our values. He'd say things like, "We are God's chosen and we must protect what's ours." The congregation ate it up. My parents, my neighbors, everyone. They'd nod and clap and say amen, while I just sat there feeling more and more uneasy. One Sunday he announced that the church was starting a community protection group. He said it was just to make sure our town stayed safe and that everyone in the group would be volunteers. At first, it sounded harmless, like a neighborhood watch, but then he started assigning roles. Certain men were put in charge of enforcing the church's values, and others were told to monitor people who weren't part of the congregation. When I asked my dad what that meant, he brushed it off. "It's just to keep things in order," he said. "Father Andrew knows what he's doing." I wasn't so sure. Things escalated quickly after that. Father Andrew started holding private meetings with the men in the church. My dad started going to them, and when I asked what they were about, he wouldn't tell me. "It's church business," he said. People who weren't part of the congregation started avoiding us. I heard rumors that some of them had been confronted by the members of the protection group, told they weren't welcome in our town anymore. When I brought it up to my mom, she just said, "Sometimes you have to be firm to protect what is right." The breaking point came a few weeks later. Father Andrew's sermon that day was the most intense I'd ever heard. He was practically yelling, talking about how the world was full of sinners and how we needed to take action. We can't just sit back and pray anymore, he said. God calls on us to act. The congregation went wild. People were clapping and shouting amen like they were at a rock concert. It felt sick. After the service, I overheard a group of men talking about paying a visit to someone in town. They didn't say who, but it was clear they weren't planning to just have a friendly chat. I tried to talk to my dad about it, but he just got angry. You don't understand, he said. This is for the good of the community. I knew then that I couldn't stay. That night I packed a bag and left. I didn't even tell my parents. I knew they wouldn't understand. I tried to report what was happening to the police, but when I got to the station, I saw one of the officers talking to Father Andrew. They were laughing like old friends. I knew I couldn't trust them. It's been a few months now, and I'm still trying to process everything. I don't know what had happened to my family or the rest of the congregation. All I know is that something dark has taken over that church and I'm not going back.